This is Cindy Whitney reaching out to Tuesday Club members on this Election Day 2020. In our lifetimes, we've always had the right to vote, but this has not always been the case. In fact, until only 100 years ago, women were not allowed this privilege. It wasn't until 1920, exactly 100 years ago, that the 19th Amendment was added to our Constitution, giving women the right to vote in elections. Many activists fought hard for years to gain this right for us. One of them, Susan B. Anthony, never got to see the results of her efforts, having passed away 14 years before the amendment was passed. She believed that many things in her world needed to be changed, and she spent her lifetime fighting for temperance, abolition, women's rights, and suffrage. This is her story. Susan was born 200 years ago in 1820. She was the second child of 6 who survived beyond infancy. Her mother, Lucy, had been raised as a Baptist, but her father, Daniel, had taken on the life of a Quaker. The children were raised in their father's stricter religious traditions, although the congregation felt he was rather liberal, especially since he married outside his Quaker faith. He was even disowned by them at one point for allowing dance lessons to take place in his house. He continued to attend the Quaker meetings, however. Being raised as a Quaker influenced Susan in many ways. One of the beliefs of this religion was that people should be treated equally and have the same opportunities regardless of their skin color or gender. By the age of 17, Susan was collecting anti-slavery petitions along with her family members. Quakerism also allowed women who felt called to God to travel and preach their message to others. During her lifetime, Susan traveled a lot, giving many speeches and getting the word out about her crusades. As a child, Susan learned to read early, and although she attended public school until a teacher refused to teach her long division, she was mostly homeschooled by her father, along with her siblings and a few neighborhood children. Eventually, Susan felt that she needed more education than she was getting. At the age of 17, she was sent to a Quaker boarding school. She was used to her family's more liberal views within Quakerism, and she was not very happy there. Within a year, however, a depression caused a bankruptcy in her family, and she was pulled back home from school. This is about the time that she joined the Daughters of the Temperance in their effort to get stronger liquor laws. She also began to pull away from the Quakers after seeing what she viewed as hypocritical behavior of both members and preachers with alcohol. Susan was only home for about a year before she left home to teach and help pay off the debts of her family. 7 years later, when she began teaching at an academy in New York, she was dismayed at her salary of $110 a year as a woman, compared to 4 times that amount if she had been a man. She began to fight with the teachers' union for equal pay and continued helping them even when she left teaching. It was during this time that Susan also began to pull away from Quaker influence in her speech and in the way she dressed. She began to wear the new stylish but controversial bloomers under a knee-length dress. She felt that it was much more sensible than wearing the traditional long dress that would gather dirt at the bottom from sweeping the ground. Eventually, however, she gave up the practice of wearing bloomers when she realized that people were paying more attention to how she dressed than what she was saying. Susan grew dissatisfied with the world of teaching, and when her father coaxed her to join them on the farm in Rochester, New York, that they had purchased a few years before, she joined them and took on the job of running that farm, while her father took on a more financially stable job income as an insurance agent. The farmhouse became a frequent meeting place for anti-slavery activists, including Frederick Douglass. Susan joined in the fight for abolition, and it was at an anti-slavery meeting when she was 31 that she met someone who became a big part of the rest of her life, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They began to work together in the fight for the rights of all people. Elizabeth was better at writing than Susan, but she was also married with 7 children. Susan often watched the children while Elizabeth wrote, and then, being unmarried herself, Susan traveled to give the speeches and circulate petitions about their ideas. Elizabeth once said, "I forged the fireboats, she fired them." One of Stanton's biographers calculated that Elizabeth spent more time with Susan over her lifetime than with any other adult, including her husband. Still involved with the Sons of Temperance, Susan was infuriated at one of their state conventions when she wanted to speak as a delegate, but was told that women delegates were there to listen and learn instead. She did, however, give her first public speech at the National Women's Rights Convention around the same time. Temperance was part of the women's rights movement because the laws of the time gave husbands complete control of the family, including the finances. There was nothing legally a wife could do if her husband became abusive or caused their family to be destitute. If she filed for divorce, the husband would most likely end up getting the guardianship of any children. Susan and Elizabeth helped in the gathering of 28,000 signatures on a petition to ban the sale of alcohol in the state of New York. Their petition ended up being rejected due to the fact that many of the signatures were from women or children. And this temporarily helped move more of their focus to the specific issue of suffrage so that women could have political influence. As the Civil War approached, however, Susan turned back to being a leader in the anti-slavery world. It was during these times, as she was involved in petition drives, speeches, and the spreading of posters or leaflets, that she ran into the most hostile and dangerous interactions with the public. She had to face mobs of angry people and armed threats. Objects were thrown at her, and her image was hung in effigy or dragged through streets amid the cheering of hostile observers. In at least one circumstance, police had to escort Susan and other speakers out of the building for their own safety. By 1860, when Susan was 40 years old, she saw some success in her work. The legislature passed the Married Women's Property Act, which allowed joint custody of children and the ability of women to own property separate from their husbands. In 1865, Susan went to stay with her brother Daniel in Kansas for 8 months to help him with his newspaper. She returned to her home in New York after learning about a proposal for a constitutional amendment that would provide citizenship to African Americans. Although Susan was in support of that general idea, she and Elizabeth Stanton were concerned because the word male was part of it. They were worried that if this amendment were approved as submitted, it would take forever to get African American women to also be considered as citizens. This viewpoint led to a big rift between the groups fighting for people's rights. Some thought it better that at least black males would be able to vote as a citizen, but Susan was said to have been highly upset over this and to have said that she would sooner cut off her right hand than ask for the ballot for the black man and not the woman. A couple of years after having gained the newspaper experience with her brother, Susan and Elizabeth Cady Stanton began publishing a newspaper that they called The Revolution. It carried the masthead, "The True Republic, Men, Their Rights and Nothing More. Women, Their Rights and Nothing Less." Elizabeth did more of the writing and editing while Susan took care of the business side. The articles were about many aspects of the fight for women's rights, and it gave the women a chance to express their own opinions. That year, the 14th Amendment was passed, declaring that those born into slavery were entitled to the same citizenship as free people. It was not assumed that this included the right to vote, however. The idea behind the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote, was still being debated. Many people, including Frederick Douglass, who had worked alongside Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton to support suffrage, now found themselves on the opposite side of the fence in their support for this amendment. Susan and Elizabeth still felt strongly that this would hamper their efforts to bring about voting rights for women. At this time, they broke away from the American Women's Suffrage Association and formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. There was tension between the two groups for years. The former association tied itself closely to the Republican Party and hoped that along with the 15th Amendment, Republicans would also help establish women's suffrage. The new National Women's Suffrage Association worked for nationwide support for their cause, and they also included issues like reforming divorce laws and gaining equal pay for women. Susan began extensively traveling across the USA on the lecture circuit, and she continued this for the next 30 years. To make sure that this drive continued beyond her lifetime, she trained a young group of activists to become leaders in the cause. She referred to these young ladies as her nieces, and they often accompanied her on her rounds. In 1872, Susan, now 52 years old, decided to challenge the constitutionality of the ban on women's voting rights. The 14th Amendment that had passed 4 years before, granting citizenship rights to black people, stated that all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. It prohibited limiting the rights of any citizen. Susan felt that this should include the right to vote. She and many other suffragists registered to vote in Rochester, New York. They proceeded to vote in the presidential election that year. Anthony and 14 other women were arrested for violating the election laws, although Susan was the only one indicted for this crime. The trial, the United States versus Susan B. Anthony, was held in June the next year with plenty of national attention by the press. She was denied a trial by jury. After the judge announced his guilty verdict in a long speech, he asked if she had anything to say. Susan gave a speech outlining the injustices that she faced as a human being and an American citizen. The judge attempted to stop her midstream, but she continued on until her points were all made. She told him that even if she had been given a trial by jury, it would not have been a jury of her peers because women were not allowed to be jurors. The judge found her guilty and fined her $100. She bluntly told him that she would never pay it and they could go ahead and take her to jail. Susan never ever paid a cent of the fine, but they did imprison her, but they did not imprison her because they did not want her taking her case to the Supreme Court as she said she would. Had she paid the fine or been taken to jail, this would have opened that opportunity for her. 2 years after Susan challenged this right to vote, in 1875, the Supreme Court decided that although women were indeed citizens, this did not mean that they necessarily had that right. Individual states were given the ability to decide for themselves what to do about voting requirements. This resulted in southern states requiring the payment of a tax to vote. They also required the taking of a literacy test. Along with the common threat of lynching for trying to vote, poor black people from the South were generally kept from exercising their right until the 1960s. The United States celebrated 100 years of independence in 1876. The National Women's Suffrage Association requested permission to present their Declaration of Rights for Women at the official celebration in Philadelphia, but they were turned down. Much to the surprise of people in attendance that day, Susan and 4 women walked up onto the stage during the ceremony and handed a copy of their declaration to the official in charge. Then they handed out more copies to people in the crowd as they left. Outside in the hall, they came across an unoccupied bandstand. It became their own stage as Susan took it over and presented the declaration to a huge crowd that gathered. That same year, Susan and Elizabeth began to work on their book, History of Women's Suffrage. It took them several years to complete what became 6 volumes, working in and around other activities promoting suffrage. Writing books or speeches was not Susan's strength or pleasure. That was the benefit of having Elizabeth as a partner. Those were the kind of tasks in which Elizabeth excelled. Susan took care of the business side, including publishing. So many books needed to be stored during this time that Susan reached out to her sister Mary to use her attic for storage room. She finally had to limit the number of books being stored there because the weight was threatening to collapse the house. Susan had more determination and drive to get the task completed than Elizabeth. One time, the 2 of them traveled to an important meeting. When they arrived and Susan found out that Elizabeth's speech was not yet written, she insisted that Elizabeth not leave the hotel room until it was done, even placing a younger colleague outside the door to ensure it happened. Midway through the History of Women's Suffrage project, Susan traveled to Europe with Rachel Foster Avery, the first of the nieces that she was training. They spent 9 months there making connections with international women's rights groups. From this visit, Susan had a large part in setting up one organization for women from many countries to work together, the International Council of Women. Shortly after it began, delegates from the council were invited to the White House to meet with President Grover Cleveland. Susan's work to empower women also included an educational aspect. The University of Rochester in New York did not enroll women, not wanting to risk that they would be unable to pay. Susan worked hard along with others to raise the money needed to admit women. She even pledged the cash value of her life insurance. The goal was reached by 1900, and women students began to attend right away. To this day, the University of Rochester provides a scholarship to high school students who show leadership and have proven that they have a commitment to working on difficult social issues. The scholarship is called the Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony Award. Around this time, Susan delivered a keynote address at the New York State's Nurses Convention, advocating for the standardization of training and state registration in the field of nursing. Those goals were reached the following year. In 1905, at the age of 85 years, Susan met with President Theodore Roosevelt in Washington, D.C. about submitting a suffrage amendment to Congress. He was not interested in doing that. Susan gave her last suffrage speech a year later at the celebration of her 86th birthday, telling everyone that failure is impossible. She passed away a month later. At the time of her death, women were allowed to vote in 4 states, but it took another 14 years before her goal of national women's suffrage was achieved. Susan B. Anthony worked relentlessly over her lifetime to see women given the same rights as men. She wasn't afraid to speak and travel alone if necessary. She developed a reputation for fearlessness when facing disruptions and opposition. She lived simply, and she did not look for any kind of financial gain. Her commitment to her work caught the attention of others who could help with the funding of her projects. Susan once estimated that she averaged 75 to 100 speeches a year. It would have been difficult to do this if she had been married and raised a family. Also, if Susan had married, a husband would have needed to sign any contracts, assuming he chose to do so. With her status as a single woman, she was allowed to freely sign for herself when she was booking convention halls or having materials printed. The fact that she remained single allowed her advantages that many other women's rights activists did not have. Susan emerged as one of our nation's first female leaders, and she loved her life of being free to pursue her own interests. This past summer, on the 100th anniversary of granting women the right to vote, President Trump pardoned Susan B. Anthony for her long ago crime of taking part in the 1872 election. Susan B. Anthony, along with many others, worked hard to give us, as women, the right to vote at election times. She spent her lifetime trying to provide this for us. We are thankful, and I hope that all of you took advantage of this rightful opportunity in our current election. Susan B. Anthony would be happy. Thank you for listening today, and I wish all of you well.